presentation on standardised scores for parents by Mr. Thomas. Don't worry if you don't have an A-level in mathematics or you don't understand statistics. This is a general introduction to help you understand the scores that will be on your children's reports. I'll cover why we use standardised scores, how standardised scores are calculated, and what those standardised scores mean. So why do we have standardised scores? I think it's important to understand that we need a quantifiable, comparable and understandable measure across all of our subjects with all of our children so that we can communicate with each other about how children are performing, whether that be they're performing well or they're struggling, or if you just want to know how your child is doing in a particular term. For teachers, it helps us track their progress. It also informs planning of curriculum and lessons. And for school leaders and governors, it helps understand how the school is performing. So when we're in school, we have lots of children of different ages, gender, ability, all in different classes, all sitting different tests. From maths tests, marked out of a percentage, reading tests out of 40, spelling tests, which may be age-related or below age-related, and science tests, which could have a grade descriptor of an A, B or C. As you can see, you can't compare those. It is also very difficult to track those over time. In an ideal world, we'd want to be able to see how a child progresses from entrance in reception all the way through to year 6. And we'd also like to see how a child does across different subjects. So that is really important to be able to compare them. Also, some tests are harder or easier than others. And how do you take that into account? If a maths test has got lots of number and operations, it could be harder than another one with lots of geometry, statistics and measure. So how can you compare the two tests? Also, we only have access to our children. But how do they compare to children down the road in other schools? And how do they compare to children nationally? So we look at comparing children to the performance in the same test to children from across the UK in a variety of schools in different settings with different backgrounds of different abilities. This then gives us a really fair and robust way of understanding our child's capabilities here in school. And the way we do that is we look at their raw scores. A raw score is what they got on the test, whether that's 1 out of 50 or 45 out of 50. And we create a bar chart to see how our children performed. Now, we don't have lots of children, so here we have 12 children. It's really hard to see any patterns or any trends. Quite a few children scored 25 here at school, but nobody scored 50 out of 50. But we don't have enough children here to really make any kind of judgments on their performance. Was this good, or would we expect them to do better? So instead, we take a larger sample size, and there are companies out there that help us do this. They provide us the data from 56 other schools, and it's 1,400 children's result in the same test at the same age. And as you can see, I've put more children into my chart now, and we're starting to see a trend. The trend is that more children scored 20 to 24 than any other score. Nobody still scored up here. Very few scored in the 40s. And it's easy to see with our children that were working at 25 out of 50, we're actually working above peers in other schools. But what we do is we convert this to a line, and that line is called a bell curve. And here's that bell curve. This follows that trend of where the children were sat. And this is done on every test. So every test is standardised. It's not standardised once. So every single maths test, reading test, spelling test or science test that we do is standardised against that large sample size. And you'll see here our centre line. That centre line there is our standardised score of 100. A lot of people will talk about that score of 100 when talking about a bell curve. That's the very top of the bell curve. And if your child is within these limits of 85 to 115 on this bell curve, they're classed as age-related. They are within the average for their cohort. That is, compared to 1,400 other children, they are the same as 68% of them. The majority of them fall in here. We then also have these smaller sections. If your child scores above 115, they're above average. If they score below 85, they are below average. If they score below 70 or above 130, there are outliers. Very few children score there. They're in the top or bottom 2% of all of those children that took that test. So what does that mean for your children? Well, if your child scored exactly 100, it would mean that they're in the 50th percentile. That means if you ranked all 1,400 children end to end, from highest score to lowest score, your child would be placed 700th. They'd be in the middle. They are right in the middle of that cohort that took that test. These children here, who scored 88 and 102, they're also working at an average level. They fall still within the bulk of these children working at age-related expectation. This child who scored 116 only just fractionally got into the above average bracket. Now this is a continuum. This child could have been here, could be here, and each test they might move around. So if a child were to be in the middle of this band, you might hear words like they are securely above average. That means they're right in the middle of these bands. But this child here has just made it into the above average band. This child down here, unfortunately, finds school difficult, may have learning needs, isn't working at the expected standard as the rest of the year group. So 68% of the children work in this zone. We have 16% of the children working in this zone, 16 here, and the remaining 2% at either end. So some important things to consider when you're reading those standardised scores is that children aren't just a number. There is so much more to them, and there's so much more to school than a reading standardised score and a maths standardised score. Music, art, drama, that's not standardised, but that is all part of your child's education. Standardised scores don't take into account a bad day, or if a child is ill or not had breakfast on that day. They will underperform. It is a snapshot of one moment in time of a child's ability in one particular part of our curriculum. They are predominantly a tool for teachers. These figures that teachers have are used to inform what they then deliver. It helps improve their lessons, it helps improve their teaching. Interventions are put in place for children with lower standardised scores, and extensions are put in place for those with a higher standardised score. It's also important to note that if a child gets the same standardised score 2 tests in a row or in multiple tests, that doesn't mean they haven't made progress. By their very nature, those tests have got harder, or year on year as a child moves through school. A child with a standardised score of 100 in year 4 is working at a higher level than a child with a standardised score of 100 in year 1. Those tests have been standardised against children of the same age. So it's not a bad thing to see standardised scores not increasing. Obviously, if they do increase, it is showing accelerated progress. It's also important to note that you shouldn't compare standardised scores between children. All children are different. They're also not an intelligence test. It doesn't measure their ability to solve problems. It doesn't necessarily measure their ability in areas that aren't quantifiable. Their independence, for example, their resilience. Also, not everyone can have a high standardised score, and that's the point. If everyone had a high standardised score, the bell curve wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be the shape it is. There is always the same proportion of children working above age-related standard as there is below. So it's completely normal for children to be at either end of the spectrum, and also for the majority to be in the middle. People regularly ask about age standardised scores, and some teachers will mention age standardised scores. The way that works is that the bell curve is adjusted for your month of birth. For example here, if you're younger, it accounts for the fact that the average age of that cohort that sat the test were older than you, and moves that bell curve ever so slightly. And vice versa, if you're slightly older than the average age of the cohort that took that test, it reduces that bell curve so that we can then use age standardised scores to take into account your child's age. For example, if they were born in September or in August. I hope that's been a useful insight into standardised scores, why we use them, how we use them and what they're for. If you've got any questions, please get in touch.